Well, Kath is looking for that.
Okay.
You found it?
Now, one of the respondents she was in no opinion stated for or against sale of land, and that was on page 22 of the attachments, and she indicated that perhaps a condition such as offer acceptance is contingent on receipt of development approval for the amalgamated site from JDAP. Now, I did send an email about that, and I understand the feedback from staff that, you know, there may be some conflict with the town being the approving authority, but in the end, ultimately, JDAP is the approving authority for a development of that size, not the town. We can certainly make recommendations, but ultimately, in the end, it'll be a JDAP matter. Would you agree with that?
That is correct.
Right, okay.
The development of that scale will be determined by the JDAP.
Okay. Now, I do have supplementary questions. Now, sorry. This deputation that was from Element, now I note in there an interesting thing where it says the contract of sale conditions, and it's got 3 dot points down there. So on the first dot point, it mentions, firstly, compel the buyer to, as soon as practicable after settlement, arrange for construction of development, and defines development as one consisting of commercial and or retail buildings. Now, we all know from the concept plan that was presented that there's residential involved in that concept plan, and also from the information provided by the staff previously, and also from the objections stated by 2 of the letter writers, that the commercial footprint put forward by the Birmingham group seems to be in excess to what is applicable or with our town planning scheme. So I'm curious about why we don't have residential, like commercial, retail and or residential included in there, because that will naturally end up being part and parcel of the development somewhere along the line. Would you agree with that, sir?
The Annexure A, which is the special conditions of sale, is as presented by the prospective purchaser. It is not a town prepared document.
Right. So how does that fit with the fact that it's highly unlikely that that entire site will be developed for commercial and retail, that there will undoubtedly be a portion of residential in there? So how does that fit?
At the moment, we're simply dealing with the sale of the town-owned lot. We are not dealing with the ultimate development outcome at this stage.
So just
but this is one of the sale conditions.
Just to clarify though, where is that particular reference?
It's in the element.
I understand it's in the element, but in the documents.
Well, I don't know. I've only just got this tonight, so I haven't had a chance.
That's why I'm seeking to see exactly what is in the official documents.
It's contained within the Annexure A special conditions of sale. The reference is in clause 3.
What was it? 4.3.
Yeah.
Clause 3 deals with development.
It doesn't reference.
But the under section 1.1, under the recitals and the definitions, development means the construction of commercial and or retail buildings and associated infrastructure and services on the amalgamated land. So that's defined in the document.
Thank you.
And no, after you.
The understanding I have is that the concept proposal that we were presented was for indicative purposes only. Is that your understanding as well, or is it some further stated intention that that particular concept plan would come to fruition?
You're correct. It's for illustrative purposes and to give an idea of what the applicant broadly would like to see on the site. Obviously, as staff has reported back to council, there are some planning related issues with the scale and type of that development Those concerns have been conveyed back to the prospective purchaser, but at this stage it's largely a moot point because we're only dealing with the land transaction.
And so hypothetically, if a sale was to go through, the owner would still need to apply for rezoning to put residential on there, is that the case?
No, it's zoned local shopping under the scheme, so they could just simply do it under a development application.
Right, and so local shopping zoning currently does provide for what sort of scope of residential would be?
I believe it's in the vicinity of R80, but I can check and report that through an update to the council report next week.
Would that hypothetically apply to the whole site or a portion thereof? Are there any sort of ratio requirements built into that?
The zoning of the local centre applies to the whole site, including the town site and the Birmingham site. Obviously there are plot ratio provisions in the R codes, but we're now dealing with Design WA, so there are the fixed controls. So there are parameters to comply with. We haven't done a full and thorough assessment of the residential component of the concept. Our focus thus far has been on the retail floor space because that's what's brought the objection from Element, but we can provide some clarification on that through the updated report.
Okay, so am I right to think then that if the sale went through under the current zoning, outcomes ranging from wholly residential R80 through to wholly commercial would be possible, subject to whatever planning approvals are required?
Correct, absolutely.
Thank you.
Other questions?
The third party offer, I'm curious about that because that obviously has come about because of the advertising. Given that there's been feedback that the Birminghams are not interested in developing residential component of the site, is it permissible or is it appropriate for the town to put the two parties in contact with each other to see if there will be portions of the site that might be developed for what the other third party might think is appropriate for a portion of land or not?
I don't think there's any particular issue with putting the two parties into contact with one another. I don't think there's any particular issue with putting the parties in contact with one another. However, the role of council at this time is to make a decision on the potential sale. If council resolved to sell its lot, we could certainly make the Birminghams aware of the third party. If council does not resolve to sell the lot, there would probably be little point in doing that.
I would also indicate that it's a requirement of council to address the needs of the community, and it would seem to me from many of the responses that there is a desire to see timely development, and I'm curious about, and that development could be a mix, obviously, given the zoning of the land as indicated by Councillor Wilson, which pleases me greatly, by the way. But given the strong element coming through with all of these responses, indicating that the land has been in a derelict state for a very long time, and there's this, seems to me, an overwhelming desire in both the yeses and the nos, and even the of no opinion, to see some sort of timely development. I'm very interested in how we might be able to accommodate that. And even though this process is about the sale of the land, it more or less goes hand in hand with most of the feedback that's come back from the residents. So is there any way that the staff can see, like for instance, as per what one of the residents requested, a clause in there dependent on approval from JDAT, is there any way that the staff can see that we can facilitate that?
It would be open for council to require that and offer that as a counter offer. It's a shame the applicant isn't here or the prospective purchaser isn't here. The advice we've received from the prospective purchaser is that would not be to their satisfaction. So it'd certainly be open to council to pursue that, but it may well be tantamount to not selling the property.
So just to clarify, the staff have already had a conversation with the potential buyer and flagged that as a possibility, and they've given an indication that that's not acceptable to them?
That's correct.
May I have a point of correction there? It's actually two potential buyers, really.
Oh, I'm talking about the ones that have made the formal offer, because I believe the other offer is an informal email without anything official
Okay, so
documented.
it's not been formalised? They haven't actually given a formal offer?
The third party?
Yeah.
The third party simply sent an email offering to purchase it, but it hasn't been formalised through an offer acceptance process.
Just a small point of clarification. In the officer's report it says the town is required to comply with clause 3.58 of the Local Government Act 1995. This clause requires that the details of the proposal sale for public advertising are to include market valuation of disposition as ascertained by evaluation carried out no more than 6 months before the proposed disposition. The relevant valuation was obtained 8 July 2019. So I just want to clarify that you're satisfied that we have met our obligation underneath that clause.
Yes. So whilst it is outside the 6 month valuation, 6 month period now, at the time council resolved to advertise it, it was within the 6 months. Based on recent events and our, I suppose, analysis of the housing market and land values, we don't consider it has increased significantly, if at all. So therefore, we're satisfied that we've complied with the Act. Okay.
Hilary, do you have any questions?
Yes. Sorry, I was just a bit distracted for a sec. I guess what I'm reading in the officer's report is that the presentation of the survey responses is largely in support of sale. Is that a correct assumption? Certainly that's the officer's recommendation to dispose of Morley Drive, East Eden Hill to Birmingham properties. Correct. My question is perhaps not for staff so much as in discussions around the budget, which will come post the strategic community plan, is that if the sale of this land goes ahead, where will that money be invested? Will the money be invested into the area, Eden Hill, where it has been garnered from? Or will it be spread across the town?
That's really a decision for council. One of the projects we are undertaking this year is a review of our asset portfolio. So, as you know, we have a number of assets in need of attention. We also have a number of assets that really we need to have a discussion with council about in terms of their future intent. So this would certainly see potential future development or maintenance of assets. That's really a decision for council.
Okay. Is there any question? John, do you have any questions? Jai was next and then you, Kath.
Thank you. So the Annexure A here, the special conditions of sale, I'm just getting some clarity. Are the prospective purchasers, the Birmingham Group, proposing to include Annexure A into the contract of sale?
Mm.
Okay. So just on clause 4, option to repurchase, just picking up on the previous comments that Councillor Hamilton was making, it seems to me there that should development not occur after 3 years and notices, 6 months notice is given, they are open to us being able to repurchase the property back. Is this a binding term that they're happy to be bound by?
They are, but I would draw attention to clause 4.7, which is the definition of commenced construction, which means the stage of construction where there is an initial disturbance of soils associated with clearing, grading or excavating activities or other construction activities. So the way the terms are constructed, the way the terms have been put together, is if there are soil disturbing activities, they will satisfy their obligation.
So if, for example, they demolish the existing buildings, that would meet the requirements?
That's correct.
Just following on from the question by Councillor McWilliam, is it up to, could it be a determination of council to, instead of that money going into general revenue, being quarantined in a reserve for
Well, that would be a
development
decision
within
of
the...
council again. Kat.
Sorry?
That would be a decision of council again.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so it is potentially possible for council to quarantine that money from going, so it doesn't go into general revenue, that instead goes into the futures project fund reserve.
If that's
Is
what
that what
council
it's
chose
called?
to do.
I can't remember what it's called.
Infrastructure.
Money's fungible?
So just a couple of points in the deputation here from Element. So the second and third dot points state that secondly includes the provision for council to give notice to the buyer if construction has not commenced within 3 years of settlement, to compel the buyer to commence development within 6 months of the notice. And finally, charges the property in favour of council, includes the option for council to buy back the property if the event that council considers that the buyer has not fulfilled their obligations as stated in the contract. Do you have a position, so Element is stating that those two clauses are saying, regardless, even if the land is sold, council has an interest in the land. Do you have a position as to that?
So the interest in the land would stop a transaction and transfer of the land from the Birminghams to a third or fourth party. However, in response to Councillor Wilson's question, the threshold for what is commenced construction is quite low, to a point that it's not a shopping centre or more dwellings or mixed use that is required to invalidate the buyback clause. It's simply soil disturbing activities. But if they didn't undertake those soil disturbing activities, the town would have avenues under the annexure to buy back the property.
So as long as the soil remains undisturbed, the town continues to have an interest in that land. Is that correct?
Correct.
Can I just clarify? I understand what you've said and what the document says in terms of the definition of development. However, I'm not sure how demolition of the existing building can equate to construction. But to me, the construction or the disturbance of soil would need to relate to the intention to build something new. Do you understand?
I do, I suppose,
Yeah.
because clause 4.7 defines it that way. The answer.
Clearing, grading, excavating?
I understand that, but the term construction implies that that is done in preparation for construction rather than just for the purpose of clearing a site. I know it's Who had the next question? Councillor Hamilton?
Would the officers agree, there's two comments in the community responses which basically indicate that that buyback clause would be rather expensive for the town in respect to all the additional charges, and also the land price might have increased by then. So would it potentially be beneficial to the buyers to have that clause in there, because it's a no-lose situation? If they want to sell the land back, they'll actually make it at market value, plus all the fees will be covered by the town in buying it back. So it is actually, would the officers agree that it doesn't really benefit the town, it is a benefit to the buyer more than us?
Not necessarily, no. It doesn't oblige the town to repurchase it. It simply provides the avenue that there is an option if the town felt strong enough. And I think this clause and series of clauses around it originates from earlier discussions whereby there was concern raised by some councillors and those in the community that the site has sat stagnant for some time, and there was a desire for a mechanism to be built into the contract to allow council to buy it back.
Any other questions?
The categorisation of the responses into yes, no and no opinion, that seems like a very basic way to do it when obviously many of these responses had nuances that related to development. So I'm not sure if the staff saw any other way of actually categorising
So
this.
Councillor Hamilton, just to clarify, that was actually a specific question on the survey. So the people who responded chose that yes/no response themselves, and the staff
Okay.
just lifted those numbers out. But then all the comments provided allow the clarification of the opinions.
Okay, so given that there were so many comments that related to development, and the desire for development in both the yeses and the nos, I guess my question to staff is, could there be a more nuanced response or report, because clearly there were sentiments captured in those responses that don't come through with just the yes/no survey tick the box.
I'd go back to the opening comment, is that this proposal is quite binary. It is the Birminghams have offered to purchase the town site subject to a range of conditions. It is up to council to say yes or no. So to help council inform itself in making that decision, we asked the community whether it thought council should say yes or no, and that's why the community consultation was structured that way.
And also up to council to change or make counter offer with other conditions. Yes.
If council so chooses.
Okay.
Okay, is everyone happy to move on? Thank you. All right, 7.2, this is local planning policy number 17, grade separation at the corner of Guildford Road and Old Perth Road, and the proposal is to revocate that policy. Councillor Hamilton.
If we are rescinding this planning policy 17, how does the administration intend to promote grade separation at the corner of Guildford Road and Old Perth Roads?
We intend to capture it through the review of the local planning framework, as well as whichever framework we end up pursuing for the Bassendean town centre, be it a comprehensive local planning policy or whether it's a precinct plan or activity centre plan, we would embed it in that document.
Okay, cool.
I just had a question, obviously yourself and Donna Shaw are new staff members. Is this particular policy come to us just through the fact that you're working through old policies and have identified that this is no longer required? It's, yep.
Absolutely.
So we should expect to see a series of these coming through
Absolutely.
over the coming months?
So it's always good practice to review LPPs and council policies. We're going through that process at the moment. We've got the tree policies later in the agenda. We've got this revocation, so they'll be coming through incrementally over the next 6 to 9 months.
Great, thank you.
Can I just ask a question about the process? Why do we revoke them before you've actually got the local planning scheme framework in place, or not in place, ready to go? I'm just curious about the process. No criticism, just want to know why.
Fair enough. The policy itself and the construct of the policy does not meet the requirements of a local planning policy. It's not guiding any particular decision.
Okay.
So it's rather than have a poorly conceived policy hanging out there, it'd be good practice to remove it as soon as possible.
Okay.
So, having read the policy, it appears to relate to people who are not council. Is that the correct way to describe it? It's saying here that the owners of properties are encouraged to investigate the possibilities.
One of the many reasons we're recommending it be revoked.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? No? 7.3 is the draft local planning policy number 13 relating to tree retention and provision. I had a question around the metrics. So when this was presented to Design Basso and Council recently, we had a conversation about potentially reviewing the original metrics that were proposed. I was a little bit confused because in the report it refers to a minimum of one small tree for every 350 metres, which was my understanding was the original proposal. And then in the attachment, it seemed to have changed that to a medium tree. Is that what the intention was?
I think the error is a drafting error in the actual council report, not the attachment, because the attachment reflects the discussion that took place at the workshop, but we will update the OCM report.
Okay, so what staff are now proposing is similar concept to previously, just with the increased requirement for medium tree rather than small. Great, thank you. Councillor Wilson and then Councillor Hamilton.
Thank you. So, to be enforceable, does it need to be incorporated within the town planning scheme?
No, the planning regulations allow a council to make a local planning policy, so there's no requirement to embed it into the local planning scheme. You will note the policy though does deal with tree protection orders or preservation orders, sorry, and that is to clarify the requirements, and it's quite appropriate that a policy would go to a next level of detail on a provision already contained in the scheme. In terms of the provisions relating to retention and new trees, there doesn't need to be an overarching head of power in the scheme.
Councillor Hamilton?
In the attachment 3, page 3, 5.2c, it states retention of a medium or large tree retained can offset the planting of 2 medium trees.
Sorry, where are you looking, Councillor Hamilton?
Okay, so
5.2c.
So 5.2 in the attachments.
Yeah.
And point number C. So it's got the number of trees required by clause A may be reduced by 2 where a tree subject to a tree preservation order or a medium or large tree is retained on site and protected by a tree growth zone subject to the submission of details of the proposed measures to protect the trees identified on the tree or trees identified on the site as outlined in Australian standards, blah, blah, blah. Now, the point that makes is that if there's a large tree on site, for the development, for every 350 square metres, the proponent is required to plant 1 medium tree, but if they retain 1 large tree, they can dispense with planting 2 of those medium trees. But because that policy says large or medium tree, it means they can retain 1 medium tree on site and still dispense with planting 2 more medium trees. So I just was curious about the metrics on that.
To be quite simply, that was probably in response to some of the discussion at the workshop where there was a desire to have greater incentive to retain existing vegetation rather than simply mandating the provision of new trees.
And just to clarify, I imagine these would be mature, medium or large trees as opposed to a tree that has the potential to be,
Just a clarification on the definition. So at clause 5.3A4, which is page 4, the last page I think of...
Sorry, where are you, Jai?
Sorry, tree
Next
retention and provision policy. It's the last page of attachment 3 if you're following along. So at 5.3A4, it talks about a species declared a noxious weed. I know there's a couple of different definitions floating around. Is it intended that that's the declared plant control table from the WA Department of Primary Industries, or is there another list?
That would seem reasonable, but point's taken that it needs to be better clarified, and we can do some work on that during the week.
Yeah, maybe just tighten off a little on that. Thank you.
Just in terms of the size of the trees, there was a discussion at the meeting with Design Bassendean about this topic, and from memory the description of the canopies was about height, width, but in in those discussions, I think I raised the possibility of vertical canopy and whether that would be acceptable, given that, you know, it might be, if it's a poplar or something, it might be 2 or 3 feet wide and 30 feet tall. So it's just a different kind of canopy. So in terms of the definitions of the surface area of the canopy, that would be acceptable.
The policy has been put together based on our review of Design WA, as well as a number of existing local planning policies throughout the metropolitan area, which focuses on the breadth or the lateral measurement of the canopy. It would be possible to add another assessment element in there, but I think in all likelihood, in my experience with these sort of policies at other places, the focus is going to be on canopy breadth. It is just, if it is adopted by council, it is a local planning policy which can be varied, and we would assess any variation against the objectives of the policy, and if the objectives are being satisfied via another means, the development could be supported in any event.
So for example, if somebody was putting in a row of high-standing shrubs that actually block the sun from the side of their house or whatever, that could be acceptable in the future, or within the guidelines, or within the policy as it is, or do we need to consider that now?
I think it'd be acceptable that the policy is advertised in its current format. If we were to get a number of applications all seeking variations to the policy because they focused on vertical canopy as opposed to horizontal canopy, and we, like the comment to the Mayor before, is that we routinely review our LPPs, and if there was a trend that we were noticing and we needed to respond to that, we could do that at any time through a policy review. If we got one application here or there and it was quite isolated, we could just deal with that as a potential variation to the policy, assessing the proposal, of course, against the objectives of the policy.
John? No. Chris? On page 14 of the agenda, at the top of the page, it's got the draft amended policy does not extend to commercial or industrial developments as it seeks to address the loss of urban tree canopy on infill development when infill development occurs. Is there potential to extend this policy to industrial and commercial developments, or not really?
There would be potential. I suppose we already have. There would be difficulties because the methodology is not transferable necessarily, but we already have provisions in the scheme and existing local planning policies that deal with trees and vegetation on commercial and industrial sites. So for that reason, we focused this tree policy on residential and urban sites on the basis that seemed to be the pressure point in terms of vegetation removal.
So I understand that you're reviewing a whole swag of policies, and I do know that there are policies relating to the industrial area. But given that industrial sites, we had one site on Railway Parade where not a single tree was retained. So I guess what I'm asking as councillor is, when the staff, the administration, come to review those industrial policies, perhaps there might be some consistency between what we're trying to achieve. But in any case, I do understand that there are separate policies, so thank you for that. I do have one more question, if I might. On the bottom of that page 14 and the beginning of page 15, it indicates that it talks about the relocation of existing trees. And I just found that a little bit difficult to comprehend, how you can have a legal requirement to ensure that should the tree not survive, the obligations to provide a trees is still met. So given that the development might have been completed and 2 years, 3 years later the tree dies, blah, 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 I'm not sure how you intend, I understand you'll probably have a legal agreement put in place, but how do you intend for them to meet that obligation if that tree dies? Is it like replacement with a giant mature tree of that size in the same place, or is it planting just new trees that are small?
I'd suggest it would be the former, that or a like-for-like situation. If they have retained an existing tree and for that reason had some benefit via the incentives of the policy and therefore not provided trees on other sites, we would, I'd suggest, want to oblige them to plant the same size tree as they lost through the relocation.
Okay.
I'd suggest
that is
this...
just for relocation, which
Correct.
is highly unlikely anyway, given the costs that's applicable.
It would be the exception,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. Okay, that's it.
Great. Everyone happy? Okay, we'll move on to 7.4. This is the Animals, Environment, Nuisance and Pests Local Law, and I believe Elizabeth Kanya. How do I say your surname? Sorry, Elizabeth.
That's right, Kanya, but
Kanya.
this was Donna's, so there was a...
Also, it's now you. You again. Is there anything that you'd like to comment on before councillors ask questions?
There was a series of questions lodged by a community member. Didn't this come to council in 2019? The answer is yes. It last came to council on the 26th of February 2019. So in terms of the community member's question, that is correct.
It came to council for the purpose of advertising to the community, is that correct?
That's correct.
Any questions?
Yes, your wish.
Clause 2.8, I suspect, Councillor Wilson.
In and around those areas, yes. So at clause 2.8, and for the benefit of staff who weren't here for the previous discussions that we've had on this, with your indulgence, I'll go back over old ground. So some of the requirements appear to limit the number and type of dwellings that would be able to have fowl, according to this. So, for example, the requirement that it be that poultry be kept, or that no poultry are kept within 9 metres of a neighbouring dwelling.
Which dot point is that?
Sorry.
Yes, I can see it.
2.81A.
Yes.
Yes. So, would that be measured from the corner of the poultry enclosure to the property boundary, to the property on an adjacent, to a building structure on the adjacent property? How do you imagine that's going to apply?
Our view would be, in terms of, it would be like measuring setbacks for a development application, it would be the shortest distance.
Sorry, the shortest distance to a property boundary or to a structure on an adjacent boundary?
It would be to the neighbouring dwelling.
So the dwelling, the building on the adjacent
That's correct.
property. Okay. So what's the science behind the 9 metres? Do we know?
Our health officer has done a review of local laws around the metropolitan area, and that seems to be broadly the accepted distance. So a lot of the metrics are somewhat arbitrary. It's not an exact science. It's about, I suppose, the general mitigation of risk, and the accepted practice seems to be those metrics.
So can I just clarify, so on point 2 there, under 2.8, it has provision there for written application to vary the provisions. It's probably not something that you can necessarily answer, but maybe the health officers. What factors would they take into consideration if somebody made an application and these distances couldn't be met for them to potentially approve?
It would include, amongst other things, the number of birds they want to keep, the specifics regarding the enclosure, and probably to a large extent any feedback from the affected neighbour.
So if the neighbours were agreeable, and only had a small number of birds, then potentially there could be a significant reduction or a reduction in those distances.
So if that's the operational intention, or the advice of the staff is that that would be the operational intention, would that be quite a laborious and time-consuming process to have to individually assess applications for chickens? Is there perhaps other flexibilities that we could look at putting in here that would reduce the workload on staff?
Our experience both here and elsewhere would suggest it's not going to be overly burdensome in terms of the keeping of chickens and the lodgement of applications to vary from the local laws. So if an application was lodged, obviously the Environmental Health Officer would need to go and assess the site, seek comment from the affected neighbour and make a value judgment. But we don't envisage a number of applications that would be outside our current capacity to handle.
Okay. So at 2.81C, where it's talking about the distance from property boundaries, is the intention there noise, or is the intention that maybe pests or something like that wouldn't be able to go under an adjacent fence?
Yeah, typically it's the nuisance and the vectors of disease. So it is, again, a risk mitigation measure. 1.2 metres doesn't mean there will be no pests or the abutting neighbour will not be in any way affected, but our review of the available documentation suggests that's a reasonable distance. Again, if someone wanted to make an application to depart from that and demonstrate good on-site management, demonstrate good acceptance from the neighbours, and presumably have a reasonably small number of birds, there would be no philosophical reason to object to a departure of the local laws.
But then I guess in the absence of there being some defined set of criteria, it would possibly be entirely subjective based on the attitudes of an unelected official from day to day.
Yeah, the purpose of the local laws is to put some parameters in place so everyone has a starting point. Obviously from there things can be determined site specific.
Okay, so accepting that a lot of this is sort of guesswork and somewhat arbitrary, I think, with words that you used before, do you think it would be possible that the 1.2 metres from the property boundary could be dispensed with if there was additional requirements such as the fence went 300 mils into the ground, there was an enclosed area? Are there any public health reasons that you could foresee that would prevent us from being able to establish some criteria for fowl enclosures on a property boundary?
We could potentially review that, but I think there's some issues with the time frames in terms of having to make this local law, but Elizabeth might want to speak to that issue.
If I might, because it's been since February 26th that we've actually put this out for advertising the first time council looked at it, it's been, by the time it will be advertised and put into the Gazette and sent to the Joint Standing Committee, you're looking at about 13 to 14 months. There is precedent from the Joint Standing Committee that they may not, or they may disallow a local law for the length of time that it drags on from first advertising to the making of it and subsequent gazettal. I've been given an undertaking at the moment from the Joint Standing Committee that they will actually consider this local law and the other one that's on your agenda, so that we can actually send it to them for consideration with the likelihood that it won't be disallowed on the basis of time.
So just in relation, sorry, thank you for that. In relation to Councillor Wilson's queries about other provisions, would there be nothing stopping us from having a list of criteria that if somebody came to the town wanting an enclosure that didn't meet the requirements, that we could provide to them as an example of maybe if you consider these things, it would become an acceptable enclosure? Is that not having to feature in local law, but something that may, limiting the number of chickens and things like that, that would provide some, guidance for people?
We could certainly develop guidelines and put them up on the website to say if you're looking at varying any provisions in the local law, these are the things that will be considered and these are the measures that will work in your favour. That can be done without actually changing the draft local law. The issue that we have, I suppose, is if we are to make significant changes to the local law and make it materially different, it may well be that we'd have to effectively recommence the process.
So, just to pick up on the point, Your Worship, that you made then, I don't think what you asked for would be possible on a plain reading of the local law as it's put there. At 2.81, it says all poultry are to be kept in an enclosure not closer than 1.2 metres. So,
Yes, but it does also say that upon written application, you may request permission to vary the provisions contained above.
right, so then that would require a supplemental policy, is that the approach? If council were to decide to put some guidance around the decision-making process of staff, would a policy be the appropriate mechanism for that?
Either a policy or a guideline. I think from a staff point of view, we're cognizant of the considerations that council would want to have regard to. It could be formalised through a policy, or it could be a fairly informal guideline, simply customer service information. Either which way would be sufficient, I think. I don't expect a large number of applications to result from this local law.
And just to clarify, there are, not that we want to encourage non-compliant poultry enclosures, but there will be a number of people in the town who are currently non-compliant, and unless there's a complaint, we're not hardly going to go and seek them out to find non-compliant chicken owners. Any other questions? Councillor McWilliam?
I noticed the reference to pigeon lofts, conditions for keeping of pigeons in limited numbers, and you're applying the pigeon loft maintenance as being the highest standard that would apply to all caged birds being housed in lofts in the back of people's houses, etc. Well, not in their houses, but perhaps in the block. You say in limited numbers. What do you mean by limited numbers? Because people with fancy pigeons can have lots of birds, of lots of types of birds. People who have other caged birds, might be showing birds, selling birds, they have quite significant numbers as well. So what is the limited number reference point?
I'm sorry, what clause are you referring to?
I'm looking at, 2.9, conditions for keeping of pigeons in limited numbers. I can't see any particular reference to what the numbers are limited to.
I think that goes back to 2.71B.
Doesn't it?
2.7, hang on.
2.71B, I think.
Ah, sorry.
There we go.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Thank you. So
Is your
that's,
question satisfied?
I'll just have a look if you don't mind. I have some experience with large numbers of birds. Never have 30 geese, never. Peafowl. And pigeons. Okay, so that's saying, this is saying 12, subject to paragraph 1B, not keep a combined total of more than 12 poultry or caged birds or 6 ducks without the written approval of the local government on any one lot of land. Not to keep more than 12 pigeons unless the owner or occupier is an affiliated person, meaning belongs to a pigeon club. Is that what we're saying? Is that what that means? Yes. In which case a maximum number of pigeons may be increased to 75. So subject to clause 3, not keeping any of the following, so those particularly noisy birds and other caged birds. So it says geese, turkey, peafowl, rooster, other caged birds. That's pretty broad. So I guess people are going to have to approach the council and ask for permission if they've got more than 12 and register as owners of larger numbers. So I'm aware of people in the town that will not be complying with this at the moment, so there'll be need for some public education on that.
Is that just a comment? Seeking a response?
Will there be? public awareness once goes through the local law. If we get it through in time and everything goes according to plan, there'll be some sort of public awareness campaign.
It has to be gazetted, and that's I suppose the formal process, but there's no reason we can't raise awareness through Thrive or the website.
Yeah, I think in all fairness to people, that would be wise. Yeah, thank you.
So just at 2.8E, 2.81E, it says that the enclosures have an otherwise unobstructed area of at least 20 square metres. There doesn't appear to be any wording there linking the size of the enclosure to the number of fowl. Presumably it means that if you have one chicken, you need to have a 20 square metre enclosure for that one chicken. Am I reading that correctly?
Unless otherwise approved by the local government, that's correct.
Just on a point of practicality, that would mean pretty much that every single person looking to put in a portable or mobile chicken run on their lawn or a chicken tractor would have to make an application to council to be assessed by staff, because it would be 1.5 square metres rather than the 20 square metres. Is that, or am I missing something there?
Is it cubic? Does it include the area above the ground space?
No, it says here at 2.81E that it would be 20 square metres as the size of the enclosure regardless of the number of chickens.
That's correct, that's the condition.
And that's the intention of staff's advice, that's correct?
Again, based on the review of the other available local laws, that is what is deemed to be industry standard.
Okay, so I appreciate that we've received advice from staff about timelines. It has been some time before this, since this matter's come before us. Should council decide to change some of the numbers there, possibly hypothetically the minimum size of a chicken enclosure, how would that process then work to make it an operable?
In terms of minor amendments, so non-significant amendments, you can make those amendments before it goes to council for formal adoption, if you so choose, or at the council meeting. I would stress that's not the best practice, but you can make those amendments. In terms of making an amendment as well, be mindful, and I'm not the health officer, but be mindful there are guidelines and policies that are out there from the various, I think, is it the Department of Environmental Regulation, that are actually already there in place and that this local law probably complies with, and what a local government district must comply with. So, but I'm not the health officer,
So if it's not the case though that there is a state requirement that all chicken enclosures must be 20 square metres even if there's one chicken, am I correct to understand that we can change some of those numbers in a council decision and then that would still flow through the normal processes? Would it have to go out, to further public consultation if those changes were made?
if it was deemed non-significant, no.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Hamilton? As a non-chicken owner with absolutely no knowledge of chickens whatsoever, it might sound like a really stupid question, but here goes. My understanding is a lot of people who have enclosed backyards simply have the enclosure to put their chickens in of a night time, and they let their chickens roam the backyard during the daytime. Is there anything in this policy that causes that to be a problem? Yes, it seems to be the enclosure is the problem, but...
It is, but if you look back at 2.1AB, it's about where the poultry can approach, and that is within 9 metres of a public street, public building, commercial premises or food premises. So that does limit where the chicken can run wild, so to speak. But yeah, broadly the provisions are around the actual enclosure where, as it says, that they would be kept at the night time.
So, Councillor Hamilton, when you look at the summary of submissions, the response from the town says the local law requires poultry to be confined to their enclosure. It also requires poultry to be confined to the enclosures. The practice of free ranging leads to birds entering neighbouring properties, damage to garden beds and plants, noise, and the fouling of surfaces. So the policy isn't intending to deal with free ranging chickens in people's yards. Is that correct?
Yes.
Any further questions?
There is reference to cats and dogs in the policy.
There's separate local laws, are there not?
Sorry, Hillary, I didn't hear what you asked.
I was making the reference to cats and dogs,
Okay.
keeping animals. I don't know, find that.
We do have separate local laws for cats and dogs.
Yeah. So, but in terms of this, there is no
Implications.
particular implications. I was thinking about, I was thinking about cats in particular. Okay, thank you.
Okay, if everyone's happy, let's move on to 7.5, which is the waste local law. I'm not going to say who's responsible for this one now. Did you want to speak to this?
Only as much as reiterate the comments beforehand, which was, again, this was advertised back in February, in 26th, and then went through an advertising process on the 5th of May. There is, as you all notice, some amendments that have been made to the draft of the proposed local law. That is to realign it back to the WALGA template, because there was deviation from the template, and we are aware that the Joint Standing Committee will not allow a deviation from the WALGA template. There is likelihood that we will also be required to make an amendment to the local law once it is actually been adopted and made by council, because every waste local law requires the Director General of DEWA, Department of Water and Environmental Regulation, to give the consent, and consent was provided to the proposed local law with a deviation to the draft. So there are 2 minor deviations, and we have to wait to see what the Joint Standing Committee will do with regards to those. And it is likely that a minor amendment will be made after it's been dealt with.
Any questions? Okay, thank you. 7.6, this is swimming pool and spa safety inspections. So this is you as well, is it, Mr. Gibson? I just had a question from Sarah Quinton. Just let me pull it up, hold on. She firstly asked, how many people have we fined under the current system, which you may not have that information on hand, but also, do we follow up with non-compliance shortly after it's identified? She's suggesting that maybe it's identified and people are given some tasks to undertake, but querying whether or not we follow up to ensure that those tasks have been completed.
In terms of the first question, I don't have the answer here, but I can do some investigation and report back.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the second part, yes, that is the process where there is found to be a breach in terms of the barriers. We basically give them a
Period of time? Or?
period of time to undertake certain action and then go back and check it.
Right. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Worship. My question is just wondering, just with the staff allocation for this, would this increase the cost to the town? Because I would imagine the $24, $29, whatever it may be, going up to $30 thereabouts, wouldn't be cost recovery for us, I wouldn't imagine.
The more frequent the inspections, I suppose the greater workload over a 4-year period. Whilst $58 doesn't generate cost recovery, it is the maximum we can charge.
So I'm just a little confused because it says on page 28 annual is $58, but then on page 28, and then on page 29, it says that we're going to 2 yearly, but the 2 yearly fee is thereabouts $30, 29.2022. So I'm not sure how the 58, which is annual,
They get charged that every year, John.
even without an inspection.
So the way the levy works is you can only charge what is the annual inspection regime if the town decides.
Oh, okay.
So we at the minimum we have to
Yes.
inspect every 4 years, and based on the current,
I see. Okay.
based on the $58.45
Yes.
being the maximum, that means over a 4-year period we can only charge effectively $14.60 a year, which is equivalent to $58.45.
Oh,
over a
okay. So
4-year
every pool owner has to pay that every year, regardless if there's an inspection or not. Whereas I was thinking only if you had an inspection did you pay.
No, they'll pay every year, and they'll get their
Okay.
inspection every 1, 2, 3.
Oh,
4
okay,
years
thank
as
you.
council
Yep.
dictates.
Thank you.
Who sets that maximum?
The state government. I can provide more
Do
details.
they review them for cost recovery?
I can check that.
Because it does seem like something that the individual property owners should be paying the full amount for, rather than other ratepayers covering the cost.
Or they should be having more pool parties for all of us.
Yeah. Other questions?
In terms of the status of of the pools and spas, are these built-in pools and spas that the town actually is aware of? Or are you is there again, the need to actually ask people to own up to the fact that they have a pool or a spa which they may have bought for the summer? Or
No, these are pools that we have in our system.
I am aware, though, that they have been identified just from staff going along streets and so on at times. So
yes, I've had conversations with those staff and they asked me where the pools were.
Any other questions? Okay, great, thank you. 7.7, this is the new single-use plastics and balloons policy. Phil, did you wish to speak to this at all?
The purpose of this purpose of this is to adopt a policy on single-use plastics throughout the town. It is to strengthen the town's position on phasing out single-use plastics and support alternatives, and to ensure the ban is adopted in applicable activities and events.
Thank you. I had a couple of questions for you, if you don't mind. On the first page of the policy, on the second dot point, it says this policy does not apply to, and the third point it says activities operating under a lease agreement from the town. But then in the next dot point it says persons to which this policy applies shall first agree to ensuring the following requirements are met prior to being issued approval to lease. So they seem to be a bit contradictory to me.
Yeah, there's some contention around some of the detail there that I'm getting across, so yeah.
Okay.
What section was that in, sorry?
That's on the first page. So the second dot point has 3 points to it. The third point relates to a lease agreement for the town, with the town. And then the next section, you follow what I'm saying? It doesn't apply to activities operating under a lease agreement from the town. And then it talks about ensuring the following requirements are met prior to being issued approval for a lease. Should that be a hire?
Yeah, I'll have to clarify that.
That would be great. On the second page, I just wanted to clarify as well, the top point there is referring to plastic water bottles. I was querying the rationale for just specifying water bottles. Had there been consideration given to, for example, plastic soft drink bottles and so on?
I'll have to check that one as well.
Thank you, that'd be great. And one last question. I was just wondering what the intention was with vendors in particular who are non-compliant. So for example, I'm aware that even though we haven't had the official policy in place for a couple of years now, it's been communicated to vendors that are attending to our events, in particular food trucks, that there's a requirement to not provide single-use plastic cutlery and so on. And the majority of them have been very good at adhering to that, but there have been quite a few instances where people don't bother. Do the staff intend to not blacklist them, but if they're not attempting to adhere to the policy, maybe they're not weighted as heavily when they apply in future years, or how are we intending to? What's the consequence?
Yeah, there's been quite a lot of discussion around most of those points you brought up, and we haven't got satisfaction internally on those. So I'm happy to try and resolve that between now and the OCM.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Worship. My question just goes to the definition of the word balloon, as that relates back to balloons are not to be used, sold, distributed or released. The definition of balloon includes an inflatable device made of latex. I have seen safe sex devices inflated and they're made of latex. Would it, for the abundance of caution, be useful to exclude condoms from the definition, just for the avoidance of doubt? Or should we look at the necessity of including the word latex in the definition of balloon?
We'll look at that one as well.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you, Phil. 7.8, this is the new draft council policy for village treatments in the town of Bassendean. This is yours again, Phil. Would you like to speak to this?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. The purpose of this report is for council to adopt a new verge treatment policy to enable our community and the town to develop and enhance our verges throughout the town and get some better outcomes out on the streets and end up with better streetscapes.
Can I just clarify a few things, because obviously this has come to council a number of times over the last couple of years. And when it came back most recently, there'd been a change in staff and there was some things that needed clarifying. I've had the benefit of having a few more conversations with some of the staff than I think some of the other councillors. Can you correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that the intention is to have the local law and keep that fairly broad to allow people to do what they need to do, but to have the specifics around what we are encouraging more in the guidelines, which is a document that we can evolve over time. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. To have a verge treatment policy and a guidelines, for council to adopt the policy, but also to have guidelines that are more flexible and can be developed over time to enable us to end up with the best verges that we can possibly get.
And so one more point of clarification. So on the officer recommendation, point 4, it's noting the review of the thoroughfares local law will be undertaken. I'm not entirely certain where we're up to with that, because my most recent recollection is that local law came to council last year and council resolved to advertise a new version of that local law.
Lou, sorry, you may recall Brian Reid was working on this in 2019 and it came to council some time ago. It may have even been before you started, but yeah, I'm not sure. The idea was that we needed to do some work on all our thoroughfares. There was one that was considered, I think there's some broader work that probably needs to be done as part of the policy review.
And I think the previous understanding, which has since been clarified, was that we needed to update the local law specifically for this verge policy, but my understanding is that the current thinking is that that's not required, that we can achieve what we're intending with the current local law by introducing a new policy and guidelines. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's my understanding as well. I can clarify that as well.
That would be great. Councillor Hamilton?
Okay. Now, I did send an email on the 9th of March with quite a few dot points and questions and queries to which I didn't get a response. So I'm just going to work my way through these if you don't mind. Now, you've got dial before you dig in the policy, and I understand that this town is not registered with dial before you dig, but that was advice given to me about a year and a half ago, so I don't know if that's current. So would you like to check up on that? Because I don't know the status now.
I do have some answers here with me.
Yep.
I can provide them in writing or can go
Okay.
through them now.
Okay. I'll just scroll through because
So in writing's fine, is that right, Councillor Hamilton?
yep, but there are a few more questions, but I'll let someone else have a go for a minute.
I'm not sure anyone else has questions. Does anybody else? Councillor McWilliam?
Given that the verge treatment implementation is talking about the best time to do this is late autumn and winter to take advantage of the rainfall, is the intention is that this will be done and dusted.
If it's passed next week at council,
Next
it will
week.
be an adopted policy.
Thank you.
Councillor Hamilton?
I know that we do the native plant subsidy to each household, and I also have heard from community members some frustration about the process, about having to go into the council office to pay for them, and then there's gap, and then having to pick them up from the nursery and things like that. So this is only a request, but is it possible for the staff to investigate a simpler system in the future? Not for this coming year, because I understand it's too late for this coming year, but in the future, can we look at the potential of perhaps offering these seedlings for free, a certain number, a reduced number, where all they have to do is produce their identity at the nursery to collect? I mean, there are different processes available, but perhaps we could look at a simpler system for following years.
Yeah, happy to consider those sorts of things, and that's why we've adopted the structure of policy and guidelines to bring those sorts of things in.
I imagine once we have updated IT systems, there might be a possibility of online as well, which would then reduce the double contacts.
I think the reason I'm bringing it up is because some residents don't have money to put up front. So if we're going to increase uptake, it might be that if we offer a certain smaller volume for free, we might get an increased uptake. That's the only reason.
Okay. Thank you. Any other further questions?
May I ask if, actually, this may be out of line, but perhaps the Mayor can give me guidance. We have a member here who has a great deal of interest in verge transformation.
Lisa at the end if she had any questions or comments.
So I don't know if the person would like to ask questions.
Just want to say, Jai, did you have another question, please?
Yeah, so previous advice that we received in the past touched on the issue of insurances. I'm just checking to see that that's all been resolved, that the town's insurer is across this and happy with it.
Yep, that's correct.
Did you have any questions that you wish to ask? Or? Yeah, if you don't mind using the microphone, because that will be recorded. Yeah.
Is it on?
Yeah, I think you're good.
Hello? Okay. I don't have any questions. I just came to make a comment that I have reviewed the policy and the guidelines, and I think that they're very good, and I really hope that they get past the next meeting. I also want to say thanks to the officers that's worked on it. Gareth. Yeah, it was great talking with Gareth, and I can see that he's actually consulted with a lot of people, and the end result, I think it does seem to be collaborative and quite reasonable. Many measures. So thanks very much.
And thank you to you, because you have provided a lot of guidance and given a lot of your own time to this. And I know it's been a long, convoluted process, but I'm confident that we're near the end.
You're welcome. It's an honour.
If everyone's happy with that one, we'll move on to 7.9, which is the Local Government House Trust Deed of Variation.
Thank you. So on the 19th of February, I received a letter from Nick Sloan, the CEO from Welga, seeking Council's consent by formal resolution to a variation to the trust deed for Local Government House Trust. So the town of Bassendean is a unit holder and beneficiary to the Local Government House Trust, holding 7 units. The Trust Board of Management is seeking to vary the trust deed in order to assist the Trust's income tax exempt status. As stipulated by the deed, the Trust requires consent of at least 75% of all beneficiaries in order to execute the variation. As a beneficiary, the Town of Bassendean is requested to consent to the deed of variation supported by a resolution of council and to communicate this consent to Wellga in writing. So the Trust exists primarily to provide building accommodation for Wellga, and since 2014 the Trust has provided Wellga with accommodation at 170 Railway Parade, West Leederville. The current trust deed commenced in 1993 and was amended in 2002 to reflect the merger of the Metropolitan and Country Associations into Wellga. The current trust deed pronounces Wellga as trustee and unit holders as beneficiaries, with the trustee holding property and associated monies upon trust and in proportion to the units provided. The trust is exempt from income tax on the basis of being a state territory body, an STB, pursuant to Division 1AB of the Income Tax Assessment Act 1936. The amendments set out in the deed of variation are based on legal advice and intended to assist the Trust's income tax exempt status by strengthening the position that the Trust is a state territory body. The deed of variation aims to strengthen the position that the Trust is a state territory body through the following amendments. There's 3 of them: removing the existing trustee's power to retire and appoint a new trustee, enabling the beneficiaries to appoint and remove a trustee, and ensuring that the Board of Management is the governing body of the Trust.
So can I just, those 3 points are the amendments?
Yeah, that's right. That's the substance of the deed of variation. So effectively, Wellga is seeking council resolution that supports those 3 amendments, and if council so chooses to support those resolutions, I'll write back to the CEO of Wellga and advise them.
Any questions? Thank you, Peter. 7.10, determinations by the building surveyor. 7.11, determinations by development services. 7.12, accounts paid. 7.13, monthly financial report. I just had one question. You made the comment about the percentage of funds invested in non-fossil fuel investments, which is significantly lower than last month.
Yes, that's right.
Can you explain what's happened?
I can.
Yeah.
Thank you. The reason for that is that we've reviewed Bank of Queensland and reclassified them from a fossil fuel lender to a non-fossil fuel lender.
So shouldn't that have increased?
Sorry, the other way around.
Yeah, okay.
Non-fossil fuel lender to a fossil fuel lender. Sorry about that confusion. So that has reduced our percentage of investment in non-fossil fuel ADFs. As I think circulated in the bulletin a short time ago, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about ways that we can actually increase our investments in non-fossil fuel lenders. We now have a categorisation process that we can go through with financial institutions. We've written to some of them, and we're pretty confident that we can significantly increase our investment in non-fossil fuels over the next few months as further investments with fossil fuel lenders mature.
Fabulous, thank you.
Just a question. Are you able to elaborate on the reason for the reclassification of the Bank of Queensland, or?
So, one moment.
Yeah.
So slow with the device, paper to be I was just looking for the, it's marketforces.org.au that we've been using to give us a guide that has statements of that have been released by the various lenders, and it categorises lenders according to their fossil fuel strategies. And because of that, because we've started using Marketforce, that particular organisation to help us make these decisions, we've determined that we don't consider the Bank of Queensland qualifiers anymore.
Thank you. Okay, everyone happy to move on? Okay, so we're going to move on to the notices of motion. So 8.1 is Councillor Gangel's about the construction of a town centre piazza. Are there any questions on that one? No? 8.2, another notice of motion by Councillor Gangel around the creation of a tourism and marketing strategy.
Can I have a question there? I don't know whether it should be Councillor Gangel or the administration on that one. Creation of a tourism and marketing strategy. Are you envisaging this to happen in the next financial year?
Well, it's an in-house document, and I'm not expecting it to cost a huge amount. I mean, everything we do should be focused very much on marketing and getting people into the town. I'm not
so
sure.
She asked you whether you intended it to be in this financial
Oh,
year.
absolutely. I wouldn't imagine that it actually cost anything. It should be part of our philosophies and philosophical views that we encourage investment in tourism and marketing and all that sort of stuff.
So, not wanting to enter into debate, not adverse to that, but my question then flows on to the administration about in-house resources and how we might manage that at this time.
Yeah, there's probably a couple of things. We're in the process of developing a new strategic community plan, and one of the things I've suggested is following that with council, we develop a strategic communications strategy, and part of that is really marketing the town. But I guess in terms of the tourism element, there are probably some steps that precede that, and that is why the officer comment reads the way it does. There's some foundational work that needs to happen, so it's probably more an issue of maturity. So, for example, local planning strategy, getting that in place, reviewing our local planning policies. There's a bit of red tape and bureaucracy at the moment that we're trying to streamline and really open the doors and make it attractive for people to want to invest, spend, visit, live here in the town of Bassendean. So we appreciate there's probably some work that needs to precede a sort of a tourism strategy.
Okay.
Any further questions? 8.3, supporting the UN treaty.
I could ask the Mayor a question on this one.
What's the question, Councillor Hamilton?
I won't. I shall leave it for a discussion later.
Okay. So that brings us to confidential business. Are there any councillors that wish to discuss those items, or can we close the briefing now and ask the questions next week at the council meeting?
Close it now.
Pardon?
Sorry, I just have a question about what's on the website at the moment in terms of grants. They're all showing as ended last year. So the closing dates were all 2019.
They've been updated for the current round,
Yeah,
is what
they
you're
need to
saying?
be updated.
Thank you. And Peter, there were 3 items that you emailed me this afternoon that will be on the agenda next week. Would you mind reminding us of what they were? I should have.
Very importantly, the mid-year review. So that will go straight to OCM, and we have a notice of motion from Councillor Wilson, and we have.
Oh no, I could only remember those 2 as well.
Sorry, these are additional.
Yeah.
Items.
Is it the mid-year budget review?
Who said that?
The first one, yep.
Yep.
There was one other.
I know.
Phil, was it your area?
So the $20,000 weed report?
No, that's next month. That's
Okay.
next month.
And a 3rd item that we'll be notified of. I haven't got it right here either. Okay, thank you very much,
Let
everybody.
everybody know tomorrow.
Was it assets? Was that